In biology, an adaptation, also called an adaptive trait, is a trait with a current functional role in the life of an organism that is maintained and evolved by means of natural selection. Adaptation refers to both the current state of being adapted and to the dynamic evolutionary process that leads to the adaptation. Adaptations enhance the fitness and survival of individuals. Organisms face a succession of environmental challenges as they grow and develop and are equipped with an adaptive plasticity as the phenotype of traits develop in response to the imposed conditions. The developmental norm of reaction for any given trait is essential to the correction of adaptation as it affords a kind of biological insurance or resilience to varying environments. General principles. The significance of an adaptation can only be understood in relation to the total biology of the species. Julian Huxley, Evolution. The modern synthesis adaptation is, first of all, a process, rather than a part of a body. An internal parasite can illustrate the distinction. Such a parasite may have a very simple bodily structure, but nevertheless the organism is highly adapted to its specific environment. From this we see that adaptation is not just a matter of visible traits. In such parasites, critical adaptations take place in the life cycle, which is often quite complex. However, as a practical term, adaptation is often used for the product, those features of a species which result from the process. Many aspects of an animal or plant can be correctly called adaptations, though there are always some features whose function is in doubt. By using the term adaptation for the evolutionary process, and adaptive trait for the bodily part or function, the two senses of the word may be distinguished. Adaptation is one of the two main processes that explain the diverse species we see in biology, such as the different species of Darwin's finches. The other is speciation, caused by geographical isolation or some other mechanism. A favorite example used today to study the interplay of adaptation and speciation is the evolution of cichlid fish in African lakes, where the question of reproductive isolation is much more complex. Adaptation is not always a simple matter, where the ideal phenotype evolves for a given external environment. An organism must be viable at all stages of its development and at all stages of its evolution. This places constraints on the evolution of development, behavior and structure of organisms. The main constraint, over which there has been much debate, is the requirement that each genetic and phenotypic change during evolution should be relatively small, because developmental systems are so complex and interlinked. However, it is not clear what a relatively small should mean. For example, polyploidy in plants is a reasonably common large genetic change. The origin of eukaryotic symbiosis is a more dramatic example. All adaptations help organisms survive in their ecological niches. These adaptive traits may be structural, behavioral or physiological. Structural adaptations are physical features of an organism. Behavioral adaptations are composed of inherited behavior chains or the ability to learn. Behaviors may be inherited in detail, or a capacity for learning may be inherited. Examples: searching for food, mating, vocalizations. Physiological adaptations permit the organism to perform special functions, but also more general functions such as growth and development, temperature regulation, ionic balance and other aspects of homeostasis. Adaptation, then, affects all aspects of the life of an organism. Definitions: the following definitions are mainly due to Theodor Siestobzhansky. 1. Adaptation is the evolutionary process whereby an organism becomes better able to live in its habitat or habitats. 2. Adaptiveness is the state of being adapted, the degree to which an organism is able to live and reproduce in a given set of habitats. 3. An adaptive trait is an aspect of the developmental pattern of the organism which enables or enhances the probability of that organism surviving and reproducing. Adaptiveness and fitness. From the above definitions, it is clear that there is a relationship between adaptiveness and fitness. Differences in fitness between genotypes predict the rate of evolution by natural selection. Natural selection changes the relative frequencies of alternative phenotypes, insofar as they are heritable. Although the two are connected, the one does not imply the other. A phenotype with high adaptedness may not have high fitness. Dobzhansky mentioned the example of the Californian redwood, which is highly adapted, but a relict species in danger of extinction. Elliot Sober commented that adaptation was a retrospective concept since it implied something about the history of a trait, whereas fitness predicts a trait's future. 1. Relative fitness. The average contribution to the next generation by a genotype or a class of genotypes, relative to the contributions of other genotypes in the population. This is also known as Darwinian fitness, selection coefficient, and other terms. 2. Absolute fitness. The absolute contribution to the next generation by a genotype or a class of genotypes, also known as the Malthusian parameter when applied to the population as a whole. 3. Adaptedness. The extent to which a phenotype fits its local ecological niche. This can sometimes be tested through a reciprocal transplant. This allows them to create an experiment. Brief history. Adaptation is a fact of life that has been accepted by many of the great thinkers who have tackled the world of living organisms. It is their explanations of how adaptation arises that separates these thinkers. A few of the most significant ideas. Empedocles did not believe that adaptation required a final cause, but came about naturally, since such things survive. Aristotle, however, did believe in final causes. In natural theology, adaptation was interpreted as the work of a deity, even as evidence for the existence of God. William Paley believed that organisms were perfectly adapted to the lives they lead, an argument that shadowed Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who had argued that God had brought about the best of all possible worlds. Voltaire's Drive. Pangloss is a parody of this optimistic idea, and David Hume also argued against design. The Bridgewater treatises are a product of natural theology, though some of the authors managed to present their work in a fairly neutral manner. The series was lampooned by Robert Knox, who held quasi-evolutionary views, as the Bilgewater treatises. Charles Darwin broke with the tradition by emphasizing the flaws and limitations which occurred in the animal and plant worlds. Lamarckism is a proto-evolutionary hypothesis of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, whose main purpose is to explain adaptations by natural means. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed a tendency for organisms to become more complex, moving up a ladder of progress, plus the influence of circumstances, usually expressed as use and disuse. His evolutionary ideas, and those of Etienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, fail because they cannot be reconciled with heredity. This was known even before Gregor Mendel by medical men interested in human races, and especially by August Weismann. Many other students of natural history, such as Buffon, accepted adaptation, and some also accepted evolution, without voicing their opinions as to the mechanism. This illustrates the real merit of Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, and secondary figures such as Henry Walter Bates, for putting forward a mechanism whose significance had only been glimpsed previously. A century later, experimental field studies and breeding experiments by people such as E. B. Ford and Dobzhansky produced evidence that natural selection was not only the engine behind adaptation, but was a much stronger force than had previously been thought. Types of adaptations. Adaptation is the heart and soul of evolution. Niles Eldredge, Reinventing Darwin. The great debate of the high table of evolutionary theory changes in habitat. Before Charles Darwin, adaptation was seen as a fixed relationship between an organism and its habitat. It was not appreciated that as the climate changed, so did the habitat, and as the habitat changed, so did the biota. Also, habitats are subject to changes in their biota. For example, invasions of species from other areas. The relative numbers of species in a given habitat are always changing. Change is the rule, though much depends on the speed and degree of the change. When the habitat changes, three main things may happen to a resident population: habitat tracking, genetic change, or extinction. In fact, all three things may occur in sequence. Of these three effects, only genetic change brings about adaptation. Habitat tracking: when a habitat changes, the most common thing to happen is that the resident population moves to another locale which suits it. This is the typical response of flying insects or oceanic organisms, who have wide opportunity for movement. This common response is called habitat tracking. It is one explanation put forward for the periods of apparent stasis in the fossil record. Genetic change is what occurs in a population when natural selection acts on the genetic variability of the population. Moreover, some mutations may create genetic variation that will lead to differing characteristics of offspring and hence a better adaptation. The first pathways of enzyme-based metabolism may have been parts of purine nucleotide metabolism, with previous metabolic pathways being part of the ancient RNA world. By this means, the population adapts genetically to its circumstances. Genetic changes may result in visible structures, or may adjust physiological activity in a way that suits the habitat. It is now clear that habitats and biota do frequently change. Therefore, it follows that the process of adaptation is never finally complete. Over time, it may happen that the environment changes little, and the species comes to fit its surroundings better and better. On the other hand, it may happen that changes in the environment occur relatively rapidly, and then the species becomes less and less well adapted. Seen like this, adaptation is a genetic tracking process, which goes on all the time to some extent, but especially when the population cannot or does not move to another, less hostile area. Also, to a greater or lesser extent, the process affects every species in a particular ecosystem. Lee Van Vallen thought that even in a stable environment, competing species had to constantly adapt to maintain their relative standing. This became known as the Red Queen hypothesis. Intimate relationships. Co-adaptations in coevolution, where the existence of one species is tightly overbound up with the life of another species. New or improved adaptations which occur in one species are often followed by the appearance and spread of corresponding features in the other species. There are many examples of this. The idea emphasizes that the life and death of living things is intimately connected, not just with the physical environment, but with the life of other species. These relationships are intrinsically dynamic, and may continue on a trajectory for millions of years, as has the relationship between flowering plants and insects. Pollinator constancy. These honeybees selectively visit flowers from only one species, as can be seen by the color of the pollen in their baskets. The gut contents, wing structures, and mouthport morphologies of fossilized beetles and flies suggest that they acted as early pollinators. The association between beetles and angiosperms during the early Cretaceous period led to parallel radiations of angiosperms and insects into the late Cretaceous. The evolution of nectaries in late Cretaceous flowers signals the beginning of the mutualism between hymenopterans and angiosperms. Mimicry. Bates' work on Amazonian butterflies led him to develop the first scientific account of mimicry, especially the kind of mimicry which bears his name, Batesian mimicry. This is the mimicry by a palatable species of an unpalatable or noxious species. A common example seen in temperate gardens is the hoverfly, many of which, though bearing no sting, mimic the warning coloration of Hymenoptera. Such mimicry does not need to be perfect to improve the survival of the palatable species. Bates, Wallace and Fritz Muller believed that Batesian and Mullerian mimicry provided evidence for the action of natural selection, a view which is now standard amongst biologists. All aspects of this situation can be, and have been, the subject of research. Field and experimental work on these ideas continues to this day. The topic connects strongly to speciation, genetics and development. The basic machinery. Internal adaptations. There are some important adaptations to do with the overall coordination of the systems in the body. Such adaptations may have significant consequences. Examples, invertebrates, would be temperature regulation, or improvements in brain function, or an effective immune system. An example in plants would be the development of the reproductive system in flowering plants. Such adaptations may make the clade more viable in a wide range of habitats. The acquisition of such major adaptations has often served as the spark for adaptive radiation, and huge success over long periods of time for a whole group of animals or plants. Compromise and conflict between adaptations. It is a profound truth that nature does not know best, that genetic evolution is a story of waste, makeshift, compromise and blunder. Peter Medawar, The Future of Man. All adaptations have a downside. Horse legs are great for running on grass, but they can't scratch their backs. Mammals' hair helps temperature, but offers a niche for ectoparasites. The only flying penguins do is underwater. Adaptations serving different functions may be mutually destructive. Compromise and makeshift occur widely, not perfection. Selection pressures pull in different directions, and the adaptation that results is some kind of compromise. Since the phenotype as a whole is the target of selection, it is impossible to improve simultaneously all aspects of the phenotype to the same degree. Ernst Mayr, The Growth of Biological Thought. Diversity, Evolution, and Inheritance. Consider the antlers of the Irish elk. Obviously, antlers serve positively for defense against predators, and to score victories in the annual rut. But they are costly in terms of resource. Their size during the last glacial period presumably depended on the relative gain and loss of reproductive capacity in the population of elks during that time. Another example, camouflage to avoid detection is destroyed when vivid colors are displayed at mating time. Here the risk to life is counterbalanced by the necessity for reproduction. Stream-dwelling salamanders, such as Caucasian salamander or gold-striped salamander, have very slender, long bodies, perfectly adapted to life at the banks of fast small rivers and mountain brooks. Elongated body protects their larvae from being washed out by current. As a result, fire salamander, less perfectly adapted to the mountain brook habitats, is in general more successful, have a higher fecundity and broader geographic range. The peacock's ornamental train is a famous adaptation. It must reduce his maneuverability in flight, and is hugely conspicuous. Also, its growth costs food resources. Darwin's explanation of its advantage was in terms of sexual selection. This depends on the advantage which certain individuals have over other individuals of the same sex and species. In exclusive relation to reproduction, the kind of sexual selection represented by the peacock is called mate choice, with an implication that the process selects the more fit over the less fit, and so has survival value. The recognition of sexual selection was for a long time in abeyance, but has been rehabilitated. In practice, the Indian peafowl is a successful species, with a large natural range in India, so the overall outcome of their mating system is quite viable. The conflict between the size of the human fetal brain at birth, and the size needed for an adult brain, means the brain of a newborn child is quite immature. The most vital things in human life just have to wait while the brain grows and matures. That is the result of the birth compromise. Much of the problem comes from our upright bipedal stance, without which our pelvis could be shaped more suitably for birth. Neanderthals had a similar problem. As another example, the long neck of a giraffe is a burden and a blessing. The neck of a giraffe can be up to 2 meters in length. This neck can be used for interspecies competition or for foraging on tall trees where shorter herbivores cannot reach. However, as previously stated, there is always a trade-off. This long neck is heavy and it adds to the body mass of a giraffe, So the giraffe needs an abundance of nutrition to provide for this costly adaptation.